So, diseases.
Yeah.
Not genetic disease. Genetic disorders we've done, right? We talked about mutations that can cause problems, including hereditary diseases, but also including cancer, which we talked about in chapter 10, all of which have to do with mutations of your DNA that can get passed on. This is different. When we say infectious diseases, we mean the kind that can get transmitted from organism to organism. Notice I didn't say person to person. That's because that's not how all diseases travel. First of all, plenty of infectious diseases that infect other organisms, not humans. But even besides that, human diseases don't always come from other humans. But infectious diseases always do come from some sort of generally microscopic thing that gets in the human and then reproduces. General term for that is a pathogen, and there's lots of different kinds of pathogens. So the beginning of this unit is going to consist of several little lists. Okay, first is types of pathogens. I bet you know some. What are some disease-causing pathogens?
Mad-cow disease.
Less specific, like types of things that cause diseases.
Blood transfusion.
You're talking about routes of transmission. That's the next slide. Yeah, so that'll be a good one for that. That's foodborne. That's another route of transmission. I'm talking about what are the little things that actually make you sick. Good, bacteria is one. Bacteria is one. A good example of a bacterial pathogen is the one that causes strep throat. You know any others?
Germ.
Germ is sort of a synonym of pathogen. What's another kind of germ? Viruses. Good. Viruses, for example. Well, you know several. Gotcha. Can't think of any. But the flu, sure. The common cold, yep. And of course, the COVID. I got the diabetes. Yeah, so viruses, we'll learn a little more about them. They're interesting. We've already talked some about viruses. But there's more. Those are the two you would think of, right? But also there are a little more complicated cells that cause diseases. Those are problematic. What's the number one killer disease in the history of Africa?
Ebola.
Malaria. Malaria is so bad because it is a protost. Remember, protists are eukaryotic cells. Protists have a nucleus, and they have like the organelles that you and I have. And so that makes them harder to kill without killing you. You know what I mean? If you got something in you that cells are a lot like yours, it makes it harder to differentiate it. It's harder to put something in you that kills them and not you. So that's why malaria. Another one is dysentery, amoebic dysentery. It's another one. Cells are too complex. Antibiotics don't work on it. It's hard to treat. Some of you already know this, but fungi are a common pathogen. The most common human pathogen that is a fungus would be the one that causes athlete's foot. It's also, by the way, the same fungus that causes ringworm Ringworm, not a worm. It's just athlete's foot on your arm or body. Anybody who's spent lots of time in a locker room in their lives knows. Oh God, wrestling mats are just petri dishes, man. Gross. Finally, the weird one, the one we'll tell a couple stories about later, is prions. You mentioned mad cow disease. That's one of them. Prions are weird. Prions break most of the rules of pathogens.
Okay. Before this class, I thought mad cow disease was like you know how like mad cow disease causes zombies or whatever?
No.
Or at least the zombie movies I've been watching.
Oh, okay.
Like Zombieland.
Yeah.
That's what they said.
Uh-huh.
I thought it was fake.
Yeah. So did the people at first when it was discovered.
Oh my.
Okay, ich fand das, warte, ich will es einfach.
I wasn't.
It's trauma. Whatever you think or thought about mad cow disease, the truth is weirder. All right, so those are the types of pathogens. Now let's talk routes of transmission. Riley, one route of transmission. Absolutely. Not just blood, but we tend to refer to it as body fluids because if it's bloodborne, it is also able to be transmitted generally sexually, right? So body fluid transmission, or sometimes called bloodborne.
Airborne.
Good. Through the air, through cough and sneeze droplets. There are some fine lines within this kind of transmission. And COVID has actually been sort of in the thick of that. Like, does it actually go completely airborne or is it just through droplets? There's some differences there, but we'll kind of lump it all together. Ooh, yeah, waterborne, absolutely. Yep. And we'll put in what Landon said in there too. Foodborne and waterborne we'll kind of put together. Yeah, that's pretty common. Anything else? Go back to our Africa example. Or Lyme disease or Zika or
Wow, but isn't that also like bloodborne?
kinda. What are you gonna say? Yeah, insects. In fact, any animal that transmits a disease, and it's not just insects, although they're the most common, what we call vectors. Birds are also a common vector. Pets, think rabies. Absolutely. The bubonic plague was flea transmitted. Still is.
Yeah, the rats.
Oh, it's the fleas.
The rats.
Really? I thought it was the rats.
The rats.
So that's the word you want to know, vector. Okay, vector is any animal that can spread disease to people. That's a vector. It's actually a physics term. Maybe you know it from The Bad Guy and Despicable Me. Of force and direction and magnitude, right? Well, if you're wondering why they call animals that, it's a physics term, right? Well, if you think about it's a force that starts here and then goes somewhere with particular direction. Well, here's the person, and now we're talking about a mosquito, and you kind of get the picture, right?
Yeah.
Vector borne.
I remember back here. This trouble to show you.
Yes, but not right now. Wait, yeah. You called this one out too? And then there's the one that, thank goodness, it looks like COVID does not work through. We kind of thought that it did at first. There was talk about how long COVID can survive outside the body, right? And that they were finding it could survive for days on surfaces and stuff. So contact, direct or indirect, direct being like, hey, you shook hands with somebody, or, you know, you brushed up against somebody. Indirect being like, oh, you sat at a table they were at, or, you know, used the toilet they used. Took quite a while to figure out that it looks like COVID doesn't really get transmitted that way very well. Great. People can stop disinfecting their groceries. So those are the main ones, right? So we have 5 types of pathogens, 5 routes of transmission. Finally, today, let's talk about classifying diseases by what effect they're having on the population. Number one, there's plenty of diseases out there, kind of the old familiar ones, that affect people kind of about at the same level every year. They're kind of just there. The cold, the typical flu varieties. Those are referred to as endemic to a particular population. The common cold is endemic to about every population on Earth. Malaria is endemic to Central Africa. Lyme disease is endemic to the northern and northeastern United States. It's an adjective, not a noun. We don't say it's an endemic. Doesn't mean anything. If it says endemic to somewhere. There's diseases that come up, diseases that emerge, diseases we haven't seen before, and then there they are. Now that can either be because it's a new mutation, in the case of this particular coronavirus we're dealing with, or it can be because humans move into an area they've never been before and it shows up. Either way, it's called an emerging disease. And I can update my notes now.
COVID.
The COVID.
Wait, what was on there before?
H1N1. I've been teaching a long time.
I don't even know. I think that's from like when I was a child.
Yeah, it was a flu variety that came out that looked like it could have been what COVID-19 has turned out to be. Then there's diseases we thought we got rid of that come back. We call them re-emerging. Polio, infectious diseases. Tuberculosis was one that re-emerged for a while. I think it's mostly under control now. It's because they had a bad test for it. When I was a kid, the test we got for TB turned out to be lousy, gave a bunch of false negatives. So around when I was in college, they started finding, the precursor to tuberculosis in a bunch of my classmates, and everybody had to go on antibiotics for a while.
How do they come back?
Well, in the case of tuberculosis, like I said, it was because there was a bad test.
Yeah, but
For
how do they usually come back?
Well, that's an example of how. Smallpox is there with a question mark because smallpox was one of the worst diseases in history, was eradicated in the late 70s. Last case was in 77 or 76 in Somalia. Heroic efforts by doctors got rid of it, but they got rid of it by vaccinating, and we don't vaccinate for it anymore because it's not around anymore, except in cold storage in the facilities of several different countries on Earth. So if it were to reemerge, it could be a real problem. That kind of thing.
Or at least know.
The matter of getting it rolled out fast enough is a small thing, yeah. Yep, exactly. There's a book about that, by the way, called The Demon in the Freezer. That's a pretty good read. Yeah. Then the scary stuff, an emerging or re-emerging disease can become an epidemic. And this is defined in terms of control, basically. An epidemic is a rapid, uncontrolled increase. We're getting more new cases every week, typically, is how we define that. And then, of course, the next step up. Nobody used to know the word, now everybody knows the word. Which would be pandemic. Yep, an epidemic that is, has basically made its way around the globe. It is geographically widespread.